coming. Let's see, oops. Okay, so you could say that Sunrise is the last great German silent film made in Hollywood. Well, how in the world could that have happened? Apparently, studio head William Fox saw a few films that the director F.W. Murnau had made in Germany, The Last Laugh and Faust being two of them, and promised Murnau anything he wanted if he would only please come to Hollywood and make a film at Fox. What happened next, of course, is a story as old, if not older, than Michelangelo and the popes. The patron, having promised the moon, soon finds himself feeling fleeced by the artist. Costs escalate, time warps, the design department gets blamed for cost overruns, and the film, though a brilliant critical success, is a financial flop. As I said, that's an old story. Murnau's next project, of course, the producer would appear in the door of his office and say, "I wish I could give you everything you asked for, but this is all you're getting." I can't tell you how many times I've heard that line. Probably anybody in production here in this audience has heard it numbers of times as well. At any rate, the main thing to say about Sunrise is that it's an entirely designed and built film. I'm going to begin with the title sequence. Okay. I don't think I've ever seen such a type style. It's ragged edges, and it seems like it's scratched out in chalk. Well, what does it tell us? Because all choices, even a font style, have something to say, whether we're aware of it or not. Maybe Murnau had little or nothing to do with the decision, we don't know. But the font itself seems to suggest a kind of a rough sketch. It's not exactly childlike. It's straight, it's readable, but it has an unfinished feeling. It's kind of like an everyman font. Not crisp, not cursive, but more fine-tuned scribble. The titles may seem to be telling us that the director feels what you're about to see is a story of two people that could happen anywhere, any place, any time. In fact, the country and the city in the film are abstract symbols of innocence and sin. The characters don't have names, they just have titles. The man, the wife, the woman from the city. The woman from the city wears sexy black shiny clothes. The wife wears peasant costumes and has a tight bun hairdo. The man walks in a lumbering zombie-ish way a lot of the time because he seems to be hopelessly conflicted over his feelings for these two women. They're all traditional characters, familiar to literature. Now, let's look a minute at the beginning of the film. Here's a drawing that tells us it's summer and vacation time. Our point of view is high up, looking down on a train inside a glass station. Outside, through an enormous curved glass wall, is a large city full of people. As we watch the sketch, the locomotive starts to move. It becomes animated. The train and the people will move, but something about the train isn't looking real. It must be a model shot. And something about that huge glass plate wall doesn't look quite real either. The glass comes right down to the bottom of the station walkway, and clearly the city street is below that. How could that huge expanse of glass possibly be supported by those skinny little pieces of metal? Structurally, it doesn't quite make sense. There's a reason why big Victorian train stations had, as you can see, very strong structural members. But this glass curtain wall tells us something. It's a visual motif and it runs throughout the film. It suggests something about modernity, something about transparency, something about depth. We'll see it again in the film. Here's the cafe that the man and his wife go to. It's all very modern glass partitions in an otherwise traditional Viennese-style cafe full of typical Tone-style chairs. Outside you can see the traffic moving, and then there's another scene in a photographer's studio. Again, a lot of glass. Here it's draped with some curtains. And by the way, while you're watching this scene, pay close attention to a little white statue. The little white statue in the scene loses its head at a certain point. And this is also obviously probably some kind of metaphor for what's going on in the film. Who's losing their head over what? Then there's a restaurant. There's a large dance hall. The restaurant appears to be sunken, and the dance hall appears to be above the glass, above the light bulbs, and it appears to be above it. Now, these kind of glass curtain walls were sort of not peculiar to this film. It was really something going on in German architecture at the time. You can think of Walter Gropius' Bauhaus School of Design, built about the same time. And, the person who designed this film, Rocco Scalise, probably knew all he had to know about the trends in European architecture at the time, with large glass curtain walls and rounded, streamlined, modern edges. Scalise was German, of course. He was imported by Murnau. He was a theatrical designer in Berlin who'd worked with Murnau previously on the finances of the Grand Duke. And he'd also achieved some recognition with designing The Golem and the Dancing Girl, directed by Paul Wegener. As the story begins, we see vacationers on a boat in a lake pulling into a small country village. The camera moves up to show us a carefully simplified, stripped-down version of what seems to be a Bavarian village with thatched roofs, steep slopes, and some kind of half stuccoing and half timbering in the stucco. There's a church that dominates the village. This is not an American village. It's a village you might see even today in some national open-air architecture museum somewhere in Northern Europe. It's a kind of a Hansel and Gretel storybook style village, and it was completely built on the shores of Lake Arrowhead.
Wow.
This is a contemporary vision of a Bavarian village. You see the traditional ingredients there. Soon the story moves to the interior of the house where the city woman, the so-called vamp, is renting a room. She walks into the kitchen where her hosts are having their simple supper, and immediately we see something is askew. Why is the table slanting downward on the right? Why is the overhead lamp hanging at such an exaggerated angle? And why does the plank floor in the background appear to slant up and away from us? Who is influencing this scene? Van Gogh? There were, of course, techniques. These were techniques from German Expressionist theater. In the design department, these techniques are known as forced perspective. It means that here the designers are forcing the perspective of a set to give a particular emotional bent to the scene or to give greater depth, illusion of greater depth. We cheat, in other words, with the viewer's sense of scale. The casual viewer may not notice, but trained eye picks these things up. Edgar Ulmer, who was an associate designer on the film, told Peter Bogdanovich in an interview that everything was constructed through the viewfinder. In other words, if the design department built a room, it was intended to be shot from only one point of view. So if you had multiple camera positions in the room, you had to build one set for each different camera position.
Wow.
That also, of course, required that furniture be designed in this way. So the technique shows up again in this slide, which is the farm couple's bedroom. The farmer walks in, you see his full body from feet up and the plank floor at the end of the bed. The beds are set up in a strange way, opposite each other. And again, if you look carefully, you can see that the plank floor is slanting up and away from you. Later on, you can see the farmer's cottage, which is thatched roof and its picket fence and its carefully aged dog coop for the German Shepherd pet, of course. It's on a lake near the college. The dock area is draped, and it's hard to see in this slide, but it's draped with fishing nets. And we have to assume that this carefully staged fishing net business is metaphorically important. Who's going fishing here? Who's trapped? Who's gonna get caught? When the wife realizes that her husband may have something nefarious in his mind about her, she runs up a rocky slope through a forest and immediately encounters a tram running through the forest. It magically appears out of the forest. I say it's magical because it moves through the lakefront, past the trees, and all of a sudden opens up into the city, which was, which is built on the Fox lot. But the tram doesn't have a method really that you can see of transportation. There's no bug stick, so that gives it a very strange feeling of something very magical. At any rate, the man meets, this is the tram. The man meets his other woman in the swamp, which is of course another kind of metaphor. They're both sinking into some swamp of their own making. This obviously also had to be built on stage. There's a wonderful fuzzy glowing moonlight. The mud, the bulrushes, everything was brought in. It looks natural, but something gives you a hint that maybe it's not so natural. The man walks in a kind of a U-shaped path down a small rise over a fence, and you start to realize that the area he's walking through is not actually that large. Plus, if you want fog in a scene, and you need to sustain that fog over a period of time, you have to shoot on a stage. Without today's computer-generated possibilities for fog, there's no other way. It dissipates quickly, it blows away, and you can't wait forever for a right foggy night to do your work. The other thing that tells you that this is on stage is a visual effect of a wild city that appears behind them later. But Murnau and his designer were drawing inspiration from many of the 19th century moonlight paintings. It was a very popular theme in German Romantic painting at the time. There's also another scene that you'll see later on of a boat in the water, and this is another thing that has to have been built on a tank in the stage. Now, we finally come to the city. This was completely constructed on the Fox lot. If you look carefully, you see the city square appears much larger than it probably was. The buildings in the background were done with forced perspective again, probably on hardwood flats with miniatures. The city is supposed to be a generic city, but there's some strange things about it. The names are in English, yeah. The National, the Bud, the Nemo, the Metropa, the Mercedes, the Beko, the Texi. What? The Texi? What's that? And if you watch while the characters come around a nice corner in the city, you'll see some street signage on the buildings. It says Waterloo, St. Paul, 11th Avenue, and Central Avenue. Seems like the designers conflated New York City and London. The city has everything: large industrial metal bridges, an elevated railroad, a lot of neon, different kinds of traffic, and even a neoclassical style church. Those are some of the designer's sketches of the city. You can see the windows and the church and the heavy stanchions. But the thing about this design city is it seems to have something in common with Berlin at the time, which also had a lot of neoclassical buildings. Murnau is quoted as saying about the film, "In my film, you'll hardly be able to notice the square and the cars where the great emotional conflict of the two people begins. Everything, all this stuff, it's only decorative background. Only America can provide this, but it's not the most important thing." So it's hard to know how to understand this comment. No wonder the producers were losing their minds. Money got spent on sets for the principal actors to be shot in them for very brief moments. But also you get the feeling that Murnau somehow knew he was reaching into Fox's pockets as deeply as he possibly could. And what were the designers feeling, knowing that the director was asking all this work of them for something that he himself felt was perhaps not as important as it should be? But at any rate, the set conveys the enormity of the city and the smallness of the country characters stumbling around in it. The city's both overwhelming and stimulating. It's a place to lose yourself and a place you can find yourself as well. And this is showing them actually shooting on the stage set of, the backlot city. And they go to an amusement park. The characters do lose themselves in the amusement park. The camera enters a long light bulb arcade and then enters into a kind of a roulette wheel. You can see fireworks, you can see overhead Ferris wheel type things and fountains, ferns, Ferris wheels, roller coasters, merry-go-rounds, and string lights. Everything packed into one tiny space for only a couple of shots. This falls, I think, into the category of, if a little design is good, well, more must be a lot better. It's a totally dizzying optical overlay. Okay, so I've been talking a lot about the ideas in the history of art and architecture that might have influenced the design of the film, but a good film, as we know, also influences those who follow behind. I can't help but notice a striking similarity between the traffic-stopping kiss that the man and the wife share in the middle of the busy city square, and on the other side, the right side, the famously staged photograph by Robert Doisneau of a man and a woman kissing World War II away on the streets of Paris. There's so much similar about the way those two things are, the way they hold each other and the way people are looking. But of course, there's a whole lot more to say about the film. We know it won an Oscar as a, quote, unique and artistic production, but suffice it to say that from a design perspective, Sunrise is one of the most technically complicated pieces of filmmaking you might ever see. But please, don't let that get in the way. Just like the story, take you where it will. Thank you.
Thank you.